The stories contained in this podcast are the recollections of the guests we've invited onto the show. We are an outlet for people to share their truths, and we accept no legal responsibilities for the stories contained herein.
I'm Kendra Sheets.
And I'm Rich Gill.
And this is Enough, a podcast that aims to shine light into the darkened corners of the music industry while discussing the ways we can and should improve ourselves and, in turn, our community. Welcome back to another episode of the Enough podcast. This is Subtext, our shorter, more info-driven subset. Over the last year, we've used this platform as a way to share stories about musicians, artists, and celebrities who have all been publicly accused of rape or assault, usually by numerous survivors. Today, we're doing something a bit different, and we're discussing one man who has hurt thousands of people, but in a somewhat different way. There have been rumors of his bad behavior towards the young men that he worked with and managed, but they have been largely overshadowed by the fact that he ran one of the largest and longest Ponzi schemes in the country. For around 20 years, he defrauded investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars and destroyed multiple lives in the process. This man was also a huge tastemaker in the 1990s and the early 2000s as he created, managed, and launched the careers of the Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, LFO, Aaron Carter, and many more. This episode will be all about Lou Big Papa Pearlman.
One such story Pearlman liked to tell involves him buying out a friend's paper route for about $500. He then bought out other paper routes from other kids in his neighborhood, made a deal with Dunkin' Donuts to include donuts with the papers that were being delivered, and he hired an entire staff of paper boys to deliver them. Now, that's a pretty remarkable ingenuity for a teenager, and it's also a complete lie. That's not even how paper routes work. It is a good example of the rest of his life and career trajectory, though. Seems plausible until you start to dig in and see the cracks in his story. Another seemingly remarkable rumor was that his cousin was Art Garfunkel, which many of his childhood friends doubted until Garfunkel showed up to an event of Pearlman's. So paper route story seems like it could be true, but not true. Art Garfunkel story seems like a lie, but it is true. It's hard to keep track of all this stuff. But when it comes to Garfunkel, this familial connection is partially what inspired Pearlman's interest in music at a young age. A lot of what we're going to talk about today comes from that 3-part documentary series, as well as a 2019 Lance Bass-produced YouTube documentary called The Boy Band Con, The Lou Pearlman Story. Both docs include interviews with most of the members of Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, along with a mix of ex-employees, childhood friends, other artists Pearlman worked with, and people who were taken advantage of by him.
Getting back into the story, at a young age, Pearlman also had a fascination with blimps, planes, and all things aviation, and later started a company called Airship International, which leased blimps to companies. As a side note, to understand the strange circle that Lou ran in, I want to note that Jordan Belfort, better known as the Wolf of Wall Street, was friends with Lou Pearlman and shared in the Dirty Pop documentary that Pearlman helped him get out of a few jams over the years, especially because Pearlman never drank or did drugs, whereas Belfort, as we all know from the movie, spent most of the 80s being absolutely feral, and that's putting it nicely. Belfort actually helped Pearlman in his aviation endeavors by introducing him to major clients, such as MetLife, SeaWorld, McDonald's, along with the mob, which eventually led Pearlman to relocate to Orlando, Florida. Airship International would, in theory, lease out blimps to big companies, such as the aforementioned McDonald's and SeaWorld. One of those blimps was actually for Jordache jeans, which, depending on your listener age here, you may or may not remember ever existing. But they were very big in the mid to late 80s. So he leased a blimp out to Jordache, and in 1980, during a promotional campaign, the blimp crashed. Over the next few weeks, other blimps of Pearlman's also began to crash, which seems odd until you find out that they were all insured for large amounts of money, usually $1 million+, and all of those insurance payouts basically bankrolled his move to Orlando and the next steps in his Ponzi scheme trajectory.
Pearlman then began leasing airplanes to bands and artists, and when a band called New Kids on the Block rented one in 1989, he was intrigued, to say the least. How could a band made up of kids afford one of his planes? He looked into it and found out how much money they made on every show, and as he is wont to do, began to scheme. He continued to study how New Kids was composed of members who all had different personalities. There was the bad boy, the shy guy, the heartthrob. He figured he could use this formula and make his own version of a successful boy band. So he started Transcontinental Records and did just that. In 1993, the label released the first album of a band made up of members who were hand-selected by Pearlman himself in a $3 million talent search. That band was, of course, the Backstreet Boys. Now, for the record, let's just point out, Lou Pearlman was most definitely a sociopath and ruined a ton of lives. He was also kind of a genius, though. The way he marketed the Backstreet Boys at the beginning of their career was pretty remarkable. Instead of doing what most agents would do, which is get them on a big support slot for a larger band or send them out on a small club tour, he set them up on a tour of high schools and junior highs, playing exactly to the teenage girl crowd that they would later attract. This was similar to the mall tours that pop stars like Tiffany and Debbie Gibson did in the 1980s. Backstreet Boys played everywhere, small towns, large cities, and they hit every radio station along the way to give an interview and hype their record. After that, he sent them to tour extensively in Germany, where the brand of pop music they were doing was more welcomed by the mainstream radio, as opposed to the US, where grunge and rap reigned supreme. This is what led Backstreet Boys to getting signed to BMG Records Germany.
As we all know, Backstreet eventually rose to fame over here in the States as well. Their success is partially how Pearlman was able to fund and manage his new band, NSYNC. And there's an interesting part of the Netflix documentary which is actually discussed in more detail in the Boy Band Con, the YouTube documentary. Basically, NSYNC's attachment to Pearlman was somewhat of a secret, and he didn't want the Backstreet Boys to know that he was splitting his time and resources between the two while the Backstreet Boys were on tour in Germany. So all this stuff, while they were overseas working their butts off to try and be super mega famous, everything on stateside was happening in regards to NSYNC. So he was going through the same motions that he did with Backstreet with this new band. As multiple people said in both documentaries, Pearlman said, and I'm paraphrasing here, there's always gonna be a Pepsi to go up against Coke. And if someone is gonna create a boy band version of Pepsi, it might as well be me. So that's what he did, and it worked. And they were actually pitted against each other, both in their seeking of stardom, but also as people, trying to get along. Each side had the heartthrob, the shy guy, the whatever. And so there was almost like a West Side Story, like 1-for-1 fight. NSYNC's big break actually came because of a Disney Channel concert that the Backstreet Boys had turned down because they were exhausted from all the touring that they were doing, trying to be mega famous. So Pearlman passed the gig off to his other group, and that was great for NSYNC, bad for the secrecy of NSYNC because they blew up almost instantaneously overnight. They partially led to the creation of TRL on MTV due to the amount of teenage girls calling into the station to request both bands' videos. It also created this pop version of Oasis versus Blur battle that was happening in the UK, which was also very strange. You could like both bands, but not equally, and teenage girls everywhere felt like they had to pick a side, like, were you Backstreet, were you NSYNC? And Pearlman began taking on more and more clients because of this, because he's starting to now seem like he really knows what he's doing and figured out the formula. And then, as a result, ended up creating and managing additional groups such as O-Town, LFO, Take 5, Natural, Innocence, which at one point very early on included Britney Spears before she decided to move into a solo career, and a band called US5, along with solo artists like Aaron Carter, Nick Carter from the Backstreet Boys' little brother, and New Kids on the Block member Jordan Knight.
So at this point, his roster was overflowing and money was streaming in. But starting in the late 90s, around 1998, Pearlman's clients began suing him for misrepresentation and fraud. As the members of both Backstreet Boys and NSYNC who were interviewed for the docs tell it, the band members were so young that they basically signed bullshit bunk contracts without any outside guidance whatsoever. As one member said, and I'm forgetting which one it was, When he later brought the contract to an outside lawyer, he was told that it was the worst music contract the lawyer had ever seen in his life. The bands were given a house where they all lived together along with a per diem to use. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with what per diem is, it's basically like walking around spending money for when you're on tour.
It's like allowance.
It is. It's allowance.
Yeah.
Here's your money for the day or the week or
Yeah.
whatever. Now, as someone who spent a lot of time on tour with like small punk bands in vans, playing small clubs in the early 2000s, I'm very familiar with per diem. And the most I ever got was $20 a day, which was good money at that point.
I was going to say, that's like mega money for a punk band.
Yeah. Now, Backstreet Boys and NSYNC were traveling on private planes or selling out arenas, and they were getting a whopping $35 a day per diem. What the fuck? But now, many of these guys came from lower or middle income households, and they were suddenly being offered to them what seemed like the world, everything they had always dreamed of. All of their wildest dreams were happening. Pearlman had boats and jet skis and threw these lavish boy band parties. I would have been fucking stoked too if I was them. Like, let's be honest, Florida in the 90s, jet skis and mansions, come on, that is the dream. Both with Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, Lou legally made himself the sixth member of each of the bands. So this entitled him to his management commission along with a sixth of the money that the other band members were making without doing any of the work that the other members were doing. He explained this to them as a good thing because they weren't giving money to the label or a manager because he was acting in those roles. In having a sixth member existing, each member's share of the pot was decreased. Overall, in the 5 years since their inception in 1993, Backstreet Boys had only received $300,000 compared to the $10 million that Pearlman made off their success. He had received over 43% of their profits. There's a really interesting story about Backstreet Boys being taken out to a super nice steak dinner to receive their first huge royalty paycheck. They'd been touring and selling a bunch of records. They knew they had been selling millions and selling out arenas, so they were expecting millions, or at the very least, six-figure checks. They got $10,000 each, less than what they would have made working an entire year at Starbucks or TGI Fridays or whatever job they had before they started doing this. Both bands ended up in court with Pearlman and ultimately ended up buying him out of their contracts for a reported $64 million. As part of the settlement, Pearlman remained a sixth member of both bands and continued to receive royalties, but they were out of their contracts and free to sign with other agents.
In fact, all but one of the bands or artists that Pearlman represented would end up suing him. And all the lawsuits were either judged in favor of the bands or artists or settled out of court. Following the lawsuits, the defense lawyer, Cheney Mason, who Pearlman had hired to represent him because he had defended Casey Anthony and he wanted a high-profile lawyer, alleged that Pearlman owed him $16 million for his legal services in brokering that deal with the other two bands of the $64 million payout. Pearlman stated that he didn't have the money to pay. This will come into play later in the story, so remember that fact. After those legal troubles were temporarily solved, Transcontinental continued to expand into basically a megaverse. It was Transcon Airlines, records, entertainment, and more. Pearlman, seemingly on overdrive, bought into franchise opportunities with TCBY Yogurt and NYPD Pizza. He bought a nightclub. He opened his own steakhouse called Pearl Steakhouse. He was a partial owner of the Orlando Predators arena football team. He also bought Chippendales with the hopes of turning it into a boy band, whatever that's supposed to even mean, which is just the icing on the cake of an amazingly eclectic collection of businesses. He claimed to have orchestrated the Jackson 5 reunion in 2001, and on September 12th of that year was able to charter a plane for the band Natural when all airline travel was halted in the entire country due to what is now referred to as 9/11, where the Twin Towers came down in New York and changed air travel for the rest of time. So he allegedly was able to charter this plane by making a call to George W. Bush, but somehow he was able to get this plane and got Nashville back down to Florida so they could make sure that they made their gig. He was traveling internationally. He was buying huge houses and driving Bentleys and other super expensive cars, but it all was starting to fall apart. People began to look into how he acquired so much so quickly and how, after numerous legal battles, still had so much. What they found out was a little more than shocking.
And what did they find out? Apparently, he was buying planes with investors' money and then leasing them out and making upwards of $50 million on them. But who were the investors? It started with those crashing blimps that we talked about earlier. He financed Backstreet Boys and NSYNC from the money he recovered from those conveniently crashed blimps. But that insurance money only lasted so long. When it ran out, he had connections in Germany and did whatever he had to do to get Backstreet Boys on Germany's BMG records. However, the label deal was terrible, and they took much of the money that Backstreet Boys was making. Pearlman was receiving almost nothing, but he was able to use the bands and the BMG deal as a front to show the world that he was a super successful music mogul, sort of like a modern-day Quincy Jones or something like that, for those of you who know who Quincy Jones is. There are a number of jaw-droppingly shocking details that are brought up in these documentaries and the articles that you can read. But the one that really brings home to me what an asshole Lou Pearlman was is the revelation that the members of both of these huge groups, NSYNC and Backstreet Boys, and all of the groups he managed, LFO.
Natural had to do this too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were made to perform at Pearlman's whim in front of possible investors. He would introduce them to executives of Citibank or some other random person he was trying to get money from and say, "This is so-and-so, sing for them." So they would. And then he'd be like, "Now do another song." Like, stick a quarter in me. Such a dick move and just so insulting. He sold it to these investors that they were buying into the successful boy bands. They saw it as they owned part of the band. It was reported that he owed money to various banks and was using the success of his boy and girl band roster to convince investors to put money into a business that, when it came down to it, didn't actually exist.
And it has been said that he was not the one who robbed the bands. The money was just not there because of that label deal. But the money that the bands did get, especially in the lawsuits, came from actual people, like run-of-the-mill everyday people. To cover his costs, Pearlman began posting an investment opportunity in Florida papers. It was stated to be an employee investment savings account, but was open to everyone, which is very bizarre. And he had his reasons for this, and he was able to talk through these points and convince people why it was okay, why he had the option to be able to do this. So it offered higher returns than the financial institutions were offering at that time, which is a huge red flag. Like, there's no way that that would normally happen. You should question that instantaneously. And it also was supposedly FDIC insured, which it definitely was not. And for anyone who may need a little info on that, usually it's up to $250,000 or so. If you put this money into a savings or a money market, most banks will have it FDIC insured, meaning that in case something happens to the bank, in case we have another terrible recession, you're not going to lose that cash. So that's what he claimed. That definitely was not happening. Pearlman's lawyer, Cheney Mason, had not received payment for his services, as we talked about before, and he decided to sue Pearlman for lack of payment. Pearlman had paid just over $1 million of the $16 million that he owed his lawyer, and he sent a follow-up check from a bank in Munich, Germany, which turned out to not even exist, and the address on the check actually turned out to be a vacant lot. So Mason figured this out and then reported Pearlman to the FBI, which is where things get really interesting.
In 2006, articles began to circulate in Florida newspapers about the scheme, and people began calling for their money. To keep a successful Ponzi scheme, you need to bring in new investors to cover old investors as they pull out. But the new people were not coming in. His staff had invested, their family members had invested, friends, acquaintances, all invested. The reach was wide, especially because of the too good to be true nature of the savings account. Pearlman's long-running Ponzi scheme defrauded at least 2,000 investors out of at least $317.4 million. And that doesn't include the $200 million that he took from the banks. Out of all of this, one of the saddest things about this whole story is that there was a point in 2004 where Pearlman was under investigation for all of this, and the case was dropped by then Florida Attorney General Charlie Crist. Now, Crist was a friend of Pearlman, and Pearlman later contributed thousands of dollars to Crist's campaign. Now, I'm not saying those things are connected, but I'm not saying that they're connected, but they're definitely connected.
As officials looked further into Pearlman's background, they found that Transcon Airlines didn't even exist. So remember when we were talking about his airline company that chartered people all around and they made $50 million and whatnot? There were photos of the planes for Transcon that he had used in brochures and promotional materials. It turned out those were just model planes being held up by someone's hand, which was just out of frame of the shot, with the airport in the background. So it was all an illusion.
There's a really funny part in one of the docs, I don't remember which one, where someone is talking about, we were always flying like Delta or Southwest or American Airlines. And it's like, why are we flying these other airlines when you have planes? And there was never a good answer for it. It was just, that's what they were doing.
And that flight with New Kids on the Block that initially piqued Pearlman's interest in boy bands, yeah, that never happened. He was found to be a master forger, which is how he got that check from the bank in Munich, Germany. He was said to be a very talented artist in his younger days, forging documents by hand for friends that came in handy now, as he'd been creating seals from the banks to assist with his more personal loans. He'd borrow $1 million from one bank and then pay it back by borrowing $2 million from the next, and so on and so on. He falsified bank statements and created a fake accounting firm, which actually sent out a letter to investors, ensuring them that everything was a misunderstanding, your money's totally fine, don't pull your money out of this system, you're going to lose all this wonderful interest.
Once the pressure started to turn up in the States, which it did rapidly, Pearlman began traveling internationally, along with a member of the boy band Natural, Michael Johnson, to pitch to investors. In spring of 2007, in Bali, Pearlman admitted to Johnson that he had been forging documents and that they were not just traveling the world in hopes of getting new investors, but because they were on the run from the FBI. Johnson, who claimed to have had no idea about any of the nefarious goings-on of Pearlman's business, left Bali soon after that on his own dime. In June of that year, 2007, Pearlman was arrested in Bali and charged with conspiracy, money laundering, and making false claims of bankruptcy. This goes back to that whole thing we were saying about not being able to pay his lawyer, had the money, claimed he didn't. That's bankruptcy fraud. On May 21st, 2008, he was convicted of money laundering and sentenced to 25 years in prison with a release date of 2029. In an effort to get the funds back that Pearlman had either taken from others or hidden, the judge offered to shave off 1 month of his sentence for each $1 million returned to victims. But more than $400 million from the Ponzi scheme remains unrecovered, and Pearlman never seemed to see himself as a criminal or that he did anything wrong. He later died of cardiac arrest in prison in August of 2016.
After his arrest, before he passed away, Vanity Fair wrote an article which detailed allegations of inappropriate behavior towards some of the young men that he managed. But Pearlman was never charged with anything. This is brought up in both of the documentaries when the interviewer asks a number of the guests if they had ever heard anything about abuse or assault or had experienced anything themselves. Everyone said that they had heard things, but none had seen anything or experienced anything themselves. There was some discussion about how Pearlman would make comments about how the men would need to take off their shirts and to look good. He would check their muscles in their arms, and he would look at their abs and state that they needed to look a very specific way with their shirts off to help sell themselves, the band, and the teen magazines. He would also apparently give massages to certain members of the group.
Multiple people also said Pearlman's house was filled with cameras in every single room, and the controls were in his bedroom only. One such camera was allegedly in the tanning bed that many members of the groups used, and allegedly videos of the women who used it were shown to members of some of the boy bands. Another particularly disturbing story involved Rich Cronin of LFO, who recounted on a 2009 episode of The Howard Stern Show that Pearlman had been in contact with a German company who was interested in LFO, but only if Cronin would let him touch his penis. Pearlman had said that was just how they do business over there, and that Cronin could practice on him and he would help him get through it mentally, since Pearlman minored in psychology in college, which is so much wrong with that story and is just fucking weird and gross.
Rich Cronin has a lot to say about Lou Pearlman. It's not just the Howard Stern thing. If you Google it, he talks very openly about what he says are his experiences or things that he heard, and he's the most graphic out of anyone who's sharing stories.
Oh, absolutely. And there's lots out there. If we're covering just a little bit of it, but just Google Rich Cronin, LFO. He passed away several years ago, but
2010.
Yeah. But his stories are out there, so check them out. The other thing that is not necessarily super creepy or nefarious, but it's definitely fucking weird, is that everyone referred to him as Big Papa.
A little strange.
Yeah, gross.
So Lou Pearlman's alleged crimes are different than many of the others that we've talked about here in prior episodes of the podcast. There's no John or Jane Doe alleging assault, abuse, rape, violence. There are some more public rumors from the Whisper Network about his behavior with younger teens, as we just discussed, but nothing more concrete than that. However, Pearlman thrived in the dark corners of the music industry, among others, and his choices hurt thousands of people across the country. He scammed everyone from large banks to senior citizens who were looking to invest in something profitable to help stretch the money that they had left in their savings and checking accounts.
He scammed the members of countless boy groups, girl groups, their parents, record labels, and industry executives. He changed their lives too, rocketing them to superstardom and making them into household names. But he also bargained their careers on shoddy deals that put him and them in the red, which were covered up by more layers of his investment-based Ponzi scheme. He sold the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC as products that investors could buy into, instead of as musicians that should be supported and uplifted. And while his lack of remorse towards the victims that he scammed is absolutely vile, what may be even worse is that, based on reports of those who engaged in conversations with him while he was alive in prison, he seemingly had no regrets.
He took no accountability for the thousands of lives that he deeply and negatively affected, and even joked with some of the people over the phone about what his next big investment move was going to be as soon as he got out of jail. From what was relayed in those conversations with him, Pearlman saw jail as being a deterrent from getting back to work and making more money. It was like a blip in the radar. It wasn't really sinking in why he was there and how long he was going to be there and what this really meant for him. He seemingly never understood his own depths of corruption. As noted before, he was even offered a deal by the judge, 1 month off his sentence for every $1 million he was able to recover and return. But to this day, only $10 million of the hundreds of millions of dollars he scammed off of others has ever been recovered. As NSYNC's Chris Kirkpatrick said, quote, "He got what he deserved in the end. There are still people who are hurting because of what he did."
Enough is a podcast centering on surviving abuse, harassment, and assault in the music scene. To help get the word out, please like and subscribe and share with your friends. If you have been on the receiving end of harm from someone, be it artist, venue owner, booking agent, audience member, or someone else, and would like to share your story on a future episode, please reach out to us at thisisenoughpodcast@gmail.com. All correspondences are kept confidential.